if Russia uses nuclear weapons, it's a colossal escalation. The first time nuclear weapons have been used since 1945, and it would lower the threshold for Russia's neighbours, or for any country threatened by Russia, to acquire nuclear weapons themselves, potentially to use them against Russia. We've even heard Ukraine saying if we can't join NATO, we might have to develop our own nuclear weapons. So it's a very problematic threat for Russia itself.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by the former British ambassador to Ukraine, Leigh Turner, whose latest book is called Lessons in Diplomacy, Politics, Power and Parties. Leigh, welcome back to Frontline.
Yeah, good morning, James.
Wanted to start by getting your reaction to what President Biden has been doing in recent days. First, with the provision of these long-range ATACMS missiles for use by Ukraine inside the Kursk Oblast of Russia, but also now with the provision of anti-personnel mines to Ukraine for use in Ukrainian territory. What do you read into these decisions by the Biden administration?
It's always a bit depressing, James, to hear about the provision of these new weapons to Ukraine, which will mean more people getting killed, this war grinding on for month after month. Nobody really welcomes this kind of thing in itself. On the other hand, this will help Ukraine to defend itself against this unprovoked invasion by Russia. So in itself, this is good news. Neither of these changes, the anti-personnel landmines or the ability to use long-range missiles within Russia, will be a silver bullet that will suddenly transform the situation. But both of these will help Ukraine. It's a good step forward.
Do you think this is a reaction to the results of the US election, a sense that the Biden administration now has 2 months left in which to make any difference to the war in Ukraine, and that this is their kind of last gesture of support for Kiev?
It's certainly the case that Ukraine is bracing itself for the impact of a Trump administration. The campaign of Donald Trump has included promises to end the war within 24 hours. Nobody is quite sure what that might mean. There are glimmers of hope in as much as President Trump has deliberately adopted what some people call a madman strategy in the past, also used by Britain's Brexit negotiators, it has to be said, not always to great effect. And the madman strategy means trying to be unpredictable, trying to present yourself as being so unpredictable that your opponent will have no idea what you might do next. And it is possible that Trump will pursue policies which are positive for Ukraine. President Zelensky has been holding out hope of that in talking about his victory plan and in saying that the war might end sooner in 2025. Now that Trump has been elected, that Zelensky is probably saying that in the hope of maintaining Ukrainian agency in the face of a Trump presidency. But having said all that, having said there is still hope that a Trump presidency will be good for Ukraine, the balance of likelihood is that it may not be good for Ukraine, and that President Trump will want to reduce arms supplies to Ukraine in order to force it into a humiliating settlement with Ukraine, which involves the giving up of territory. That's what Ukraine is frightened of. And in that context, the agreement from President Biden that Ukraine can use long-range US missiles within Russia does look like a gesture to make it a bit harder for a future President Trump to change those policies and to try and support Ukraine while he still can.
Some really interesting points you raised there, Leigh, and I want to return to the issue of what a second Trump presidency will mean for Ukraine in a moment. Just first, the US Embassy in Kiev is now temporarily closed after, and I quote, they received specific information of a potentially significant air attack on the 20th of November, today. How unusual is such a decision as a former UK ambassador to Ukraine yourself? I mean, for the US Embassy in Kiev, albeit temporarily to be closed, how much import would you place on that?
It's a significant move that the US Embassy has declared itself closed. And I think the US Embassy has also warned US citizens in Kiev and in Ukraine to hunker down in the face of anticipated large-scale air attacks from Russia. We saw this right at the beginning of the war, back in February 2022, when it was anticipated, mostly of all by President Putin himself, that Russian forces might be entering Kiev very quickly at the beginning of the war. And a number of embassies, including the British Embassy, and I believe the American Embassy also, actually did close down at that time in the face of a very serious Russian threat. Now, we've heard all kinds of bloodthirsty threats from President Putin in response to President Biden agreeing to the use of long-range US missiles within Russia. He's threatening the use of nuclear weapons. He's threatening asymmetric attacks, hybrid attacks within NATO countries such as the UK or the US, all kinds of threats. And one of the easiest things that President Putin can do is to launch new attacks on Kiev and other Ukrainian cities. I should emphasize here, James, Putin's argument is always that it's somebody else's fault. He himself keeps escalating this war. First of all, he starts the war at a point where there was no possible military threat from Ukraine. Then he uses Iranian drones, Shahid drones, to attack every corner of Ukraine. He uses Russian ballistic missiles, Iskander missiles, Kinjal missiles. Then he uses North Korean ballistic missiles to attack Ukraine. Then he uses North Korean troops. So each of these steps is a massive escalation. Then as soon as anybody else escalates, he sets red lines saying, if this happens, then there will be awful consequences for you. So it's very risky what President Putin is saying. We're all very concerned about any possible use of nuclear weapons, but it is worth bearing in mind that he's been making these threats for nearly 3 years since the original Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022.
And on the point about the US Embassy, I mean, I hear absolutely what you say, Leigh, about Putin's track record of escalating this conflict. But even he surely would not be stupid enough to carry out any kind of direct attack on the US Embassy.
It's highly unlikely that Russia would deliberately attack an embassy. There are tragic precedents for this. For example, during the NATO bombing campaign in Serbia back in the 1990s, I believe it was a US missile or a US bomb struck the Chinese embassy in the Serbian capital, Belgrade. That was seen as being a mistake, almost certainly was a mistake. And I would be very surprised if the Russian forces would deliberately attack a US embassy. That would be an enormously provocative and aggressive step. However, when people start lobbing ballistic missiles and other missiles and bombs into a crowded urban area, mistakes can always happen. And there's no doubt that for anybody who's in Ukraine, this is an extremely dangerous situation. And if the US intelligence services have picked up intimations that Russia is planning further major attacks on Kiev, it's not surprising that they are taking precautionary measures.
How do you think the West should approach Russia's various threats of escalation? I mean, for instance, the fact that these ATACMS and these anti-personnel mines haven't been approved until now would suggest that the Biden administration has been wary of this threat of escalation. The fact that they still have not, and I don't fully understand why they haven't, but the fact they still have not approved the use of long-range Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles, you would have thought speaks to a fear of escalation. How justified would you say that fear is, and how should the West approach it?
It's a tricky balance, James. On the one hand, this change of Russian nuclear doctrine, which they've announced, they're now saying that an attack from a non-nuclear state, if backed by a nuclear power, will be treated as a joint attack on Russia. And it's designed to give the impression that the use of Russian nuclear weapons in response to Ukrainian attacks inside Russia has become more likely. And this is very concerning. We've seen, for example, President Macron and US spokespeople warning Russia not to make these really irresponsible threats of using nuclear weapons. You have to take them seriously, because any use of nuclear weapons would be unprecedented since 1945. So we do have to look at this with extreme concern. I was talking earlier on about President Trump using a madman strategy, and President Putin, of course, also loves to use this madman strategy. You can see the gleam in his eyes. You never know what we might do. At the same time, these nuclear threats from Russia, or the threat of using nuclear weapons by Russia, are problematic on a number of grounds. One is that it cannot be right, it cannot be permitted that if a nuclear-armed country invades another country, in this case Russia attacking Ukraine, you can't fight back. It must be possible to fight back against a nuclear-armed country. You can't just say, well, because they threaten to use nuclear weapons, the country that's being attacked can't defend itself. The second argument is that if Russia uses nuclear weapons, it's a colossal escalation, the first time nuclear weapons have been used since 1945, and it would lower the threshold for Russia's neighbours, or for any country threatened by Russia, to acquire nuclear weapons themselves, potentially to use them against Russia. We've even heard Ukraine saying, if we can't join NATO, we might have to develop our own nuclear weapons. So it's a very problematic threat for Russia itself, as well as driving a coach and horses through global efforts to stop the spread of nuclear weapons. It would be also, in the context of Russia's own nuclear strategy, using nuclear weapons is very much opening the Pandora's box. It's all or nothing. Nobody knows what would happen if a country used nuclear weapons, what that would lead to. And Russia's own nuclear doctrine suggests that once you've launched nuclear weapons, that's it. You're really opening the door to Armageddon. Now, there is, of course, one very easy way to extinguish completely any threat to Russia from these long-range missiles, from any other weapons that Ukraine has, which is to stop the war and withdraw Russian troops from Ukrainian territory that they are occupying illegally, in many cases since 2014, and the war would end tomorrow, and there would be no more threat to Russia. And that door is open to Russia, and I would strongly advise them to open it and go through that door.
Let's come on to what the return of Donald Trump to the White House means for Ukraine. Certainly in the build-up to the US election, among Ukraine supporters, there was a certain pessimism about what a Trump presidency would mean for Ukraine. I suspect in recent weeks, I've sort of picked up on, I don't know whether it's a bit of bargaining based on the reality of the situation, or whether it is actually grounded in reality, but a little more optimism about potentially what a Trump administration might mean, than it wouldn't necessarily mean selling Ukraine out. What is your sense, Leigh, of what a Trump presidency may mean for Ukraine in the war?
Undoubtedly, a Trump victory, which we have now seen in the US elections, is not what Ukraine was hoping for. And I'm sure that Vladimir Putin and people in the Kremlin were delighted with that Trump victory, simply because Trump and his supporters have consistently talked about cutting military and economic aid to Ukraine. We saw this between October 2023 and April 2024, that the US stopped providing military support to Ukraine, and that crippled Ukraine's war effort and saw rapid Russian advances. So that threat is extremely concerning to Ukraine. For the reasons that I've already set out, there are glimmers of hope. We can point to Trump being very unpredictable. We can point to Trump not wanting to hand victory to Russia on a plate. But it is quite concerning. And if Trump were to cut military supplies to Ukraine, the question then would be, is the UK and are other friends of Ukraine, such as in the European Union, ready to ramp up their military supplies to meet US shortfalls? And this would be a huge challenge. It would really mean transforming our support. Now, my view on this has always been that should Trump cut supplies to Ukraine, it would still be a really good investment for UK taxpayers and for the UK in general to up our support to Ukraine, because the alternative, letting Russia win this war, would be immensely more dangerous for us. It would create a much more dangerous world where a nuclear armed, bigger Russia, incorporating elements of Ukraine into Russian territory, would be a more dangerous adversary, more likely to attack again. And other countries all around the world that have thought, I'd like to invade my neighbor, but I'll never get away with it, will think, actually, I might get away with it. I'm going to invade my neighbor. And the UK would be in a much more dangerous international environment where our defense spending would be orders of magnitude greater than it is now, whereas supporting Ukraine would be relatively cheap compared with that. So I think we have to hope for the best with Trump, but prepare for the worst. And the worst means preparing to up our consistent long-term aid to Ukraine to stop Russia from winning this war.
What have you made of some of the mood music that's come out of the Trump campaign, or now soon to be the Trump administration, in recent weeks? I mean, for example, there was this idea of a demilitarized zone, a DMZ, between Russia and Ukraine, almost akin to what we have between North and South Korea. Do you think that is in any way feasible?
I'm very concerned about any settlement that freezes the front line where it is now, because that, in effect, means giving Russia victory. Supposing you had a demilitarized zone between what is currently those parts of Ukraine currently occupied by Russia and the rest of Ukraine, which Russia has not yet managed to invade. Russia would steam ahead with integrating those elements that it has occupied into Russia. You may recall that they've already passed legislation integrating huge swathes of Ukraine into Russia, an area about the size of England. Something like 18% of Ukraine is currently occupied by Russia. So that would be a disaster for Ukraine to freeze the front line where it is now. I've seen suggestions that you could sweeten this pill or take the edge off such a disastrous outcome by saying, first of all, that that land remains part of Ukraine legally, but Ukraine continues to occupy it for the time being. This would be what's known as the East German model, where Western countries never accepted that East Germany was a separate country or that it was going to be part of Russia. I mean, they did eventually, some of them set up embassies in East Berlin, but it was still seen as being part of Germany. And you could do that with Ukraine, where areas occupied by Russia, such as Crimea or eastern Ukraine, were recognized as still being part of Ukraine in a longer term settlement. That's one option. But this would be a very tricky path to go down. And for me, I'm afraid, allowing Russia to keep territory which it has seized by force against international law would not only mean Russia winning this war, and Putin winning this war, but would also, as I said earlier, make the world a more dangerous place by encouraging other countries suddenly to see, actually, we can invade and occupy our neighbours without long-term consequences.
On that note, in terms of trying to persuade Donald Trump and his administration to be more sympathetic towards Ukraine, do you think one of the stronger arguments that Ukraine allies can make is that, look, Vladimir Putin is allying himself through the use of Iranian drones, for instance, with Tehran, which is an enemy of America. It is increasingly building an alliance with North Korea and also China. Do you think that is an argument to which Donald Trump and his administration may be more sympathetic? Because very often your sense is, particularly if you read the outlandish tweets, for instance, of Donald Trump Jr., that they see Ukraine as just being this far-flung country in Eastern Europe, which matters little to the average American.
There is always a strong trend or tendency towards isolationism in the US. There's a kind of two tracks of foreign policy within the US. One is to say the rest of the world is a long way away. The US, the United States, has this privileged geographical position where its only land neighbours are Mexico and Canada, and it's a long way from its enemies. So there has always been a trend of thought in the US that all these faraway foreign countries are not our concern. We should leave them to get on with it while we build our own wealth and prosperity at home. And before the First World War, before the Second World War, there were strong schools of thought in the US that the US shouldn't get involved. However, when US interests are threatened, the US does tend to reverse its isolationist tendency and become involved. We saw this in 9/11, of course, after 9/11, after the attacks on the World Trade Center and on Washington in 2001, where the US had been saying, well, the Middle East peace process and what happens in the Middle East is really nothing to do with us. And then after those attacks, they provoked the US into becoming very engaged in the Middle East, perhaps not to the benefit of the US or anyone else. And so you're right, James, that the fact that the Russians or Vladimir Putin, out of desperation, are turning to countries such as North Korea and Iran to help them in their desperate struggle to win a war against tiny, relatively speaking, Ukraine next door, is a matter of great concern to many in the US who are very critical of Iran. And you will remember that in the first Trump presidency, President Trump said he would solve the problem of North Korea's nuclear weapons program very quickly. He entered into negotiations with the North Korean leader and even shook his hand in order to show that he was going to make a deal, and didn't get anywhere. And since then, the North Korean nuclear program has continued, and North Korea is becoming more and more aggressive. So it could well be that there will be strategic thinkers in the US who regard Russia's embrace of these pariah states as being sufficiently serious to give them pause for thought in cutting their support for Ukraine. But we can't count on that happening. And in my view, the UK and other countries need to step up their long-term military and economic support to Ukraine to reduce the risk of any cutting of US support, making a Russian victory inevitable.
And just finally, in terms of one of those countries that may hopefully step up, we need to talk about the situation in Germany, because there's been a lot of focus on domestic politics in the US. But of course, Olaf Scholz's government in Germany has collapsed, and there will be new elections in short order. How significant is that potentially for the future of Ukraine?
It's potentially extremely serious. On the one hand, we can see that Russia is, like Ukraine, in terrible trouble militarily. Of course, Ukraine's under enormous pressure, but so is Russia. Russia is running out of troops. It's running out of equipment, all these tanks and armored vehicles it's been taking out of long-term storage. They're just running out. The Russian economy is in all kinds of trouble. These long-term sanctions are slowly crippling Russia's ability to fight a war. So this is all good. On the other hand, Russia has been hoping since launching the war back in February 2022, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, that the alliance of Ukraine's supporters, that is the US, the UK, and EU countries, plus some others like South Korea and Japan, Russia has been hoping that that alliance will splinter. And the longer this goes on, this war, the more likely it is that that alliance will splinter, because unlike in Russia, all those countries that are supporting Ukraine are subject to democratic elections. And that means that there is constant pressure on them to come up with new policies or to change their policies. Now, we saw just recently a call from Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, to Putin for the first time that he'd spoken to him, I think, since 2022. And many people saw that as being the German Chancellor responding to pressure from other political parties in Germany, in particular the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, which is a right-wing party, and the Bund Sarah Wagenknecht, which is an extreme left-wing party, both of which support Russia in this war. And the fact that Scholz was facing electoral problems led him to make a call to Putin. Now, the Germans say that Scholz condemned Russia's attack and called on Moscow to negotiate for a fair peace and talked about Germany's unwavering determination to support Ukraine. Nonetheless, the long-term pressures on Western countries, including, of course, in the UK, mean that we always have to be alert to countries weakening their support. And in Germany, we see that there are many streams of thought, just as there are actually in France, or indeed now in the US, where there is always a risk that some of these countries may weaken their support for Ukraine. So we need to be steadfast in supporting Kiev.
Leigh Turner, really appreciate your insights and analysis. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you very much. Good to see you.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.